Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to this episode of All Things Policy, your favorite daily public policy podcast from the Takshashila Institution. I'm Anushka Saxena, a staff research analyst with the Indo-Pacific Studies program at the institution. And today, I'm privileged to be joined by Ms. Laura Silva, an associate director at Pew Research Center. And I was hoping today I could have a conversation with Ms. Silva about the latest Pew survey assessing views and opinions of China. And there have been really interesting trends that this survey report has recorded. It's a fairly recent report. It came out in mid-July. And it has looked at as many as 25 nations, specifically the views of the people therein about China as an ally to the US or as an economic power in and of itself. And I believe this conversation could be kind of an excellent foundation to uncover how trends and attitudes on China look like. And for that, again, Ms. Silva, I welcome you to this episode. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thanks so much for having me.
Right. So before we get into the conversation, just as an elaborate introduction, Ms. Silva is, as I mentioned, Associate Director at Pew Research Center. She is an expert in international survey research, and she's written about a variety of topics, including global attitudes toward China, views of democracy, and opinions about foreign policy. And she has a couple interesting reports in addition to this survey report. For example, one of them is about a data essay comparing US and Chinese soft power. And there's a report on an open-ended question about what would improve democracy. And even a report about what makes life meaningful. And I'm going to implore the listeners for this episode to absolutely read that one, because it really is a game changer. But today, for this conversation, I hope we could focus on the July 15th report. And, at the outset, I think the report talks about how, this is a survey that has been conducted for many years now. And it is perhaps for the first time since, the COVID-19 pandemic hit, and there was an overall sentiment of hostility toward China, that there are favorable views of the country and of its leadership. And so leaving it at that, I think I'm excited to explore the nitty-gritty of this research and of the views uncovered. So, Ms. Silva, without further ado, if I can pose my first question to you, maybe to set the ground for the listeners, what is the kind of methodology that is deployed to assess these views and narratives of people, as it were, right? I'm sure there would be some degree of subjectivity based on geographical location, because in geopolitics, the geo angle is ever present, right? So what kind of subjectivity then you have to uncover during the survey process, and not just on the basis of maybe location, but also age, degree of awareness, so on and so forth. So, Ms. Silva, over to you.
Yeah, I love starting with methodology because I do think that that's one of Pew Research Center's strengths. So we do nationally representative surveys, which means that we make sure that everyone in a given country has a probability of selection. We conduct our surveys differently depending on the country. So, for example, in many of the middle-income countries where we survey, we do face-to-face surveys, which means that interviewers are going door-to-door in different locations to knock on the doors and to randomly choose someone within the household and to interview that person. When we design our face-to-face samples, we do have to take geography into account. So we do what's called stratifying them by both rural and urbanicity, and also by geographic location. So, for example, in India, we cover the vast majority of the provinces in India, and we have both rural and urban locations, and we have many thousands of individuals that we talk to. And then we will weight the data using kind of a survey technique to make sure that the actual percentage of people in our sample matches the Indian census when it comes to things like age, gender, region, education, and other factors. In some other countries, we are doing phone surveys. So that's the vast majority of the European countries, Japan, South Korea, Canada. So what we do there is we random digit dial, meaning that we randomly choose phone numbers. So everyone with a phone has a chance of selection, which is the vast majority of people in all of these countries. And we call a small share of landlines in most places and a large share of cell phones, because that is what most people are using these days. And we keep close track of this and change it each year as is appropriate. But so for those, we'll call people and we'll interview them. If it's in a landline, we'll again do in-home selection. So once we reach that household, we'll randomly select a respondent. And then in both the United States and Australia, we're using what are called web-based probability panels. So you can't just choose to be on our survey by clicking a link. We actually recruit people using offline methods. So for example, address-based sampling, meaning where they live in the United States, they get a postcard. The postcard helps them opt into our online sample. And then again, we'll kind of conduct the survey online and then weight it appropriately. So all 25 of our countries are nationally representative surveys, though done by these different modes. And so when you talk about subjectivity, I think it's important to note certainly that the questions that we ask can lead people to answer in certain ways. We try and minimize that to the best degree possible. So we really follow best practices when it comes to survey methodology. We don't use agree or disagree scales. We make sure that we have balanced response options and other things to try and minimize this. But when it comes to the sample, each sample should be representative of that given population on factors including age, gender, region, urbanicity, and education.
Right. That's really interesting and quite detailed, ma'am. And in the context of then a survey, for example, assessing views of China, the sampling and the weighting and the diversity of tools deployed to conduct the survey, the rigorousness of that is obviously very important. But then when we talk about China, how is it that subjectivities in the views themselves, in your opinion, are reflected? Have you observed trends, for example, that in a particular region, there are more favorable or less favorable views of China, or among a particular age group, for example, maybe those who have looked at China longer by virtue of, having been around for longer, or is the youth different in that sense? So any of those views?
Absolutely. So there are major differences when it comes to age in terms of views of China. So younger people in many of the countries, if not most of the countries surveyed, tend to have more positive views of China. And this is something that we've seen through many of our surveys in recent years. This is not always unique to China. So younger people are often more internationally oriented. They're more likely to have positive views of many foreign countries. They're often more likely to have positive views of multilateral institutions. And sometimes they're more likely to just kind of favor global cooperation when asked about in different ways. But it is very clear that in most of the countries surveyed, younger people have more positive views of China. In terms of regional differences, we often look more at broader regions. So, for example, people in sub-Saharan Africa and people in Latin America, on balance, have more positive attitudes towards China than people, for example, in Western Europe. And views across the Asia Pacific vary somewhat widely. So we see relatively positive views in places like Indonesia, but quite negative views in places like Japan and South Korea and India. And so we can look within the country, but typically we're looking kind of at these broader patterns because we're focused on the 25 country comparative lens as opposed to the kind of sub-country level of analysis.
Right. That, yes, absolutely makes a bunch of sense. And coming in from foreign policy and geopolitical lens, some of the findings kind of also act as a springboard for the research that you're pursuing and really give meaningful data and substantiveness to the arguments or the anecdotal evidence that maybe a geopolitical researcher would observe. So it makes a bunch of sense. And so from the findings based on the attitudes and the trends themselves, what would you say would be the 2 or 3 most interesting things in your opinion that the listeners should take away right at the outset, right? maybe it was, views of Xi Jinping as a leader, views of things like US-China relations. And these takeaways, I think, when backed with data-oriented analysis, could be really meaningful because, everyone's asking million-dollar questions. Where is the US-China relationship going? What does Trump have in mind? So on and so forth. So any two or three things you found interesting?
Yes, it would definitely be $1 million question if I could explain to you what Trump has in mind. But I can tell you how people around the world are viewing the United States and China. So I guess the three things I would say as like key takeaways from the reports that we've been releasing. First is that Donald Trump receives mostly negative ratings. So in the 24 non-US countries that we surveyed, more than half and 19 of them say they lack confidence in him to do the right thing regarding world affairs. And majorities lack confidence in him on specific issues too. Like they have limited confidence in him when it comes to handling the global economy, limited confidence in him when handling relations between Israel and its neighbors, limited confidence in him in the Russia-Ukraine war. My second point would be that against this kind of backdrop, views of the US have gone down pretty significantly. Ratings of the US declined in 15 of those 24 countries, including major drops in countries like Mexico, Sweden, Poland, and Canada. In places like Mexico and Canada, obviously the US's closest neighbors, views of the US are at or near historic lows. And so views of the US have really kind of suffered this year. Again, my third point would be against this backdrop, views of China have gone up. So it's not to say that majorities around the world have positive views of China. That is not the case. We actually, on balance, still see more negative than positive views of China in the 25 countries, this time again, including the US, and more negative than not ratings of Xi Jinping. But they are up in many of the countries that we surveyed. And in many of them, this is the first time they've gone up since 2020 in the context kind of the COVID pandemic when they hit kind of record lows in many places that we surveyed. So my 3 points would really suggest that there's been a major shift with regards to how both superpowers are viewed in many countries. And in some countries, including some of the US's closest allies like France or Canada, there's no gap between the two. They're seen in equally positive lights, both kind of the leaders and the countries. And that's the first time really since the end of Trump's first term.
Right. That is really interesting. And I think, at least to me, is a classic example of how narratives shape narratives. And then when there is an intensive discussion on things like, how the tariffs are maybe really destructive for the trajectory of globalization or the global economy, and how China has really been able to kind of counter American maneuvers on this front, then when both these narratives kind of interplay together, it may perhaps influence opinions for each of the parties. And of course, I think then this also speaks to an additional point about how even though we knew Trump was coming for a second time to office, we may not have been prepared enough, and hence the things that have unraveled have kind of shaped opinions, perhaps for the worse. That said, it is interesting that still there is a deep-seated sense of suspicion, perhaps in more countries than not, about vis-a-vis Xi Jinping or China. And I think, again, from my perspective, it seems like that could be a trend that will continue. But you also talked about France and Canada, which is interesting. Any particular differences across region or age groups or the surveyed populations that could speak to why views of France or the French leader or Canada or the Canadian leader haven't changed as much?
So in Canada, we just released a new blog yesterday about kind of the views within Canada in particular and the long-term trends. And it's part of a bigger pattern that we see, and I think something you were interested in talking about, which has to do with ideology. And in many countries, including France and Canada, ideology plays a role, particularly in views of the United States. So people on the right, people on the ideological right, people who support in Europe, like right-wing populist parties, but even more broadly, just generally more conservative, more right-wing people tend to have more positive views of the United States. There was obviously reporting in the spring that President Donald Trump played a role in the Canadian election, right? Where part of the reason that the left-wing party was able to come to victory when people didn't think that they would be able to is because they were seen as less likely to be close to Donald Trump. And indeed, we see major ideological gaps in Canadian public opinion when it comes to Trump, confidence in him to handle the global economy, views of the United States. In France and elsewhere in Europe, we also see these ideological divides. When it comes to China, the ideological divides are kind of less consistent across countries. There are only a few countries where you sit on the ideological spectrum plays a role in how you see China or how you see Xi Jinping. The US is one of them. So people on the right in the US tend to have more negative views of China. You can talk about that as the conservatives in the US or Republicans. It's true in both cases. But overall, we don't see ideology playing a large role when it comes to China. But when we think about one of the questions that we did ask, which is which country would you like to have closer economic ties with, the US or China? There are large ideological divides on that, in part because that's a little bit of a forced choice question, right? So the right, broadly speaking, is much more likely to say the US. And as a result, there's this large ideological gap, not necessarily because the left prefers China, though that is kind of how it manifests. But I think it's kind of being driven more by the right's affinity for the US under President Trump and for President Trump.
Right. And if I may, one quick follow-up about a point you made about Republicans and conservatives. Sitting here in India, US domestic politics is obviously quite fascinating. So on the ideological spectrum, is there maybe a lot of difference between strictly, as you would say, conservative views and the broader views of Republicans?
No, there are not large differences. Conservative is basically there's been ideological sorting in the United States. So the most Republicans are conservative or moderate, whereas most Democrats are liberal or moderate. Right. This is more so than was the case in the past, essentially because people have polarized and sorted according to ideology into the parties. So we usually analyze things in the United States by party, since it's such a clear way to talk about the data. People, even the world over, I think, understand our two biggest parties, the kind of dominant forces. But yeah, we do find consistently that Republicans are more negative towards China, more likely to see it as a threat. Democrats are not necessarily favorable towards China, but slightly more positive on balance, and more likely, actually, when you talk about the top threat facing the country, more likely to name Russia than China.
Oh, yeah, of course. The Russia-Ukraine factor again. And I was thinking about this, how that could also be an influencing factor, especially vis-a-vis opinions of Europeans toward the US.
Absolutely.
And yeah, this is an interesting distinction, conservative or moderate versus liberal or moderate. And why it's also interesting is because, yeah, it's a popular distinction, especially between the two parties. And yet, at least from some of the proceedings in the US Congress, it is also evident that when necessary, and especially in the face of the China threat, as it were, there can also be bipartisan consensus. So I think that's always fascinating to see. And just speaking of economic power and China's role in the global economy, ideologically, are there specific trends to observe there? Because again, as you alluded to, the de-risking question and the fears of drastic changes or repercussions in the global economy, they are looming and lingering. And again, this is a question that everyone across countries is asking, of whether or not to de-risk from China, how to de-risk from China. I think decoupling is largely out of the window now, but it continues to remain a question at least. So in terms of that economic role and the superiority or the power of China as an economy, what are some of your views on the views of that?
Yeah, so we ask a question and have for quite some time about which economic power is kind of dominant in the world. So which is the leading economy? And we found this year that more people say China than the United States, which is a pretty big shift from 2023. It varies a bit across regions as to who says which power, but generally more people now say China than did in the past, and more people now say China than the United States. In some of the middle-income countries that we surveyed, we also asked particular questions about whether or not economic competition with China or debt held by China are problems for each country. We asked those same questions about whether economic competition with the US or debt to the US is a problem. And what we saw is that in many of these countries, more people actually saw problems when it comes to the US than with China. And the same was true when we asked about investment. People generally in these 9 middle income countries thought that investment from both China and the US was better than not, but more people were positive in some of these countries towards investment from China than from the United States. So, how China is playing a role economically, particularly in middle income countries, is definitely fascinating to keep an eye on. Last year, we also asked a series of questions about how much influence China was playing economically in people's countries and whether or not that influence is a good thing or a bad thing. And we saw that, generally speaking, people in middle income countries saw China's economic influence growing and generally saw it as more positive, whereas in some of the high income countries, people actually saw it as negative.
Right. Yeah, that again is a very interesting observation because, and this is where perhaps I could, go back on my own point about narrative shaping narratives because from what I've observed here in India, there is a lot of concern surrounding the quote unquote debt trap diplomacy, the Chinese policy on that, and the Chinese ability to actually make that happen. And yet, I think maybe for the lack of an alternative, maybe for deep hesitation vis-a-vis international institutions and organizations, countries continue to partner up with China and its economy, and sometimes it's just so massive and so influential that that's maybe the best alternative. And if we are to believe that we still live in a world where comparative advantage is important and free trade is important. Yeah.
We definitely see that India stands out as being relatively more pro-US and relatively less in favor of China and more concerned about many bilateral issues. And we did have one particular extra question that we asked in India about territorial disputes. And we see that that's seen as a problem by many in the Indian public when it comes to China. So it's certainly clear that India, relative to the other kind of 8 middle income countries that we surveyed, has unique facets in the relationship with China that may play a role in public opinion.
Oh, yes, totally. I think a few of these factors, such as the territorial dispute, and of course, the fact that historically it has been unresolved and there isn't a lot of confidence among the general public about its resolution or China's intentions. The collusion between China and Pakistan, China's footprint in the neighborhood, all of these things kind of compound the issue. And then I think supplementing those views is the idea that primarily I think has taken root in a big part of the bureaucracy and the government is that the relationship with the US is arguably our most important relationship in the 21st century. But then I guess we don't know if from Trump's perspective that's the case and if the India angle to the US's competition with China is important for him. And finally, Ms. Silva, I wanted to understand what you have observed from the assessment of the views in the context of the bilateral relations between US and China. I think obviously that's a big part of how narratives on some of these things are being shaped around the world. And so how are the trends in evolving, specifically in the US or its states? And what is especially the weight of the leadership factor? So how is Xi Jinping seen and how are the views of Xi Jinping then kind of shaping the views of the US-China relationship?
So Americans are relatively negative towards China. They have majority unfavorable views and they have relatively limited confidence in Xi Jinping. And this has been the case for many years at this point, though this year was the first year that we've really kind of seen a significant increase in positive views of China. But I should note that it's marginal. The majority of Americans have negative views of China. American views of China started turning relatively more negative kind of before COVID in around 2017. At the outset, I would say, of when Trump kind of began the first trade war on China and tariffs and things of that sort. And that's when we saw Republican views of China in particular go more negative, which is suggestive of the fact that while China is held up as an enemy of the United States, or while tariffs are a focus, or while China is seen as like a key competitor, views of the public can often follow suit. And so right now, there are plenty of different types of things that Americans are paying attention to when it comes to foreign policy, not just China. We have levied tariffs on many other countries. And so we saw, for example, in the United States, that there's been an increasing share of Republicans who think that our trade relationship with Canada is unbalanced, for example, because that's been talked about. But when it comes to China, messaging and how the two countries are being presented in the media and by elites in terms of being in competition or cooperation may play a role in how the public sees things going forward.
Right. That's absolutely interesting, and of course, soon the government might change, and then the views will again be shaped by the person and the party in power. And I think that again kind of tells you how there's one thing for the world to be structured in one way, bipolarity is stable, unipolarity is not. I mean, these are theoretical views, but then when people start shaping politics and geopolitics, the game is altogether different. So this is quite an interesting kind of takeaway, especially for me. But thank you so much for your time today, Ms. Silver. All of these insights have been really fascinating, and I think they act as a really solid springboard, and not just for research from a data-oriented perspective, but also eventually for policy recommendations surrounding some of these things. These views speak to the people's perception, and if individualism matters in geopolitics, then they will hopefully also be able to shape policies, countermeasures, so on and so forth. So thank you so much again for your time today, Ms. Silva.
Sure. Thank you for having me. It was great to chat with you.
Thank you. And thank you to our listeners for tuning into another episode of All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.